Hello, everybody. I'm back to talk to you about First Monday at Jordan Hall. It's officially spring. Today, when I'm recording this, still nippy outside, but I think we're getting there. So, with spring, when April 1st comes, we all know it's April Fool's Day. And in fact, our concert is on April Fool's Day. Our program is pretty serious this time. It's celebrating birthdays of two great composers who were born on the same year in 1824. And those are Smetana and Bruckner. And they're going to deliver on us a pretty heavy dose of serious and deep music. And I began to think about that. I think we should have a lighthearted mood because of April Fool's Day first. And there's no better place to turn than our friend Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He wrote a piece for string quartet, double bass, and two French horns that's known as A Musical Joke. And the joke is really on bad composers of his day. I mean, what he was really writing about was the composers who just really didn't have very sophisticated tools and made all of the mistakes of tonal music, of parallel fifths and stupid accompaniments and all of that. So he wrote the piece, which is in four movements, and we're going to hear only two of them. But dwelling a little bit about why would Mozart do that? We have actually no firm evidence for what occasion he wrote it. But I think the idea of somebody who is as amazingly gifted as Mozart was, it's easy for them to look at those people around them who are trying to do the same thing and are not very good. And it brings out in them sometimes a little bit of, you could call it ego, or gentle fun, or nasty fun. I don't know what you want to call it. So when I was thinking about what Mozart had done, my mind went back in my memory to my early professional days in Los Angeles, when I had a lot to do with the great violinist Jascha Heifetz, who was arguably the greatest fiddler of his time. And Heifetz had a very strong sense of wit, often nasty, I would say. And he looked around him, and there were a lot of violinists who were trying so hard but just couldn't do it, and for him it was all so easy. And if you go now, these days, onto YouTube, you will find something if you look up Jascha Heifetz Masterclass. Among them is one in which, for his students sitting right there, he does an imitation of a violinist trying very hard to play one of the early classical, not most famous, concertos, and making all of the mistakes that somebody who isn't very good would do. And of course, the students are somewhere between embarrassed and laughing hard because here is their great teacher making a fool of himself. But that's kind of what Mozart is doing. So what is it about? Well, there are four movements, and we've picked two of them. The whole piece is just a little bit too much fun. Some of the things that are doing, you really need a musical education or be a composer to know what Mozart was making fun of. But we've picked two movements in which you don't know half anything. You're just going to hear things that are so weird and strange happening and so uncomfortable for the players, written by composers who really couldn't do very well, that I think you're just going to start laughing. And I know you will. So here that is. So getting now into the real meat of our program, we have two extremely important composers, both born in 1824. And the first of them I'm going to talk to you about is Bedřich Smetana. He became known later in his life as the father of Czech music. But it didn't exactly start that way. So Smetana was born in a small city somewhat east of Prague. His father was a businessman, but he was also an amateur violinist, and his mother was a dancer. So there was a sense of the arts in the family. His first language was German because where he grew up was part of the Habsburg Austrian Empire, and that's what everybody learned. His father apparently could speak Czech, but chose not to because German was the language of business. So he started to play the keyboard very early, and actually the first time he played in public in front of people, he was a pianist age 6. So he'd been bitten strongly by the music bug. He was a good student, but he wasn't really very often happy with the people who were teaching him, and so he was being moved around from city to city by his parents to find a place that was more appropriate for him. Turned out that he could become a very good piano teacher, and the earliest way he earned his living and began to pay his bills was by running a program for young people playing piano. Off and on, he lived in many different cities, but he was in Prague then, and that's where he had that first success. And he was in a school where somebody could help him with his urge to write music, and so his earliest works start from them. We don't know about them very much because they were, maybe student-type works, but there was something going on there. Now, he was a man with a very complicated, busy, romantic life. He had real girlfriends from an early age. He married one of them, and his wife gave birth to 4 daughters for them. A lot of very unhappy things happened in that marriage. First of all, the youngest daughter died. This was not uncommon in those days because medicine was really not able to do what it can today with newborns and with kids. And all of those things hurt, but what really hurt was when his eldest daughter was 4 years old. She died. And she died of what we now know as scarlet fever. Her name was Bedřich, if I pronounce it correctly, I hope so. And in response to that, he wrote one of the pieces that is very often played, and it is on our program. It was a piano trio. So Bedřich was 4.5 years old when she died, and she apparently had shown talent for music, and that made it even more painful for her father. And I want to go sideways for a second to tell you about a personal experience that had no bad outcome but was frightening at the time. The first time I went to be a player to Marlborough, I guess I was about mid-30s, and maybe a little more, and I was assigned to play the Smetana trio, which I had never heard before. The pianist was somebody we know very, very well. Now he even is called Sir András Schiff, great pianist from Hungary. He was there that summer. And the violinist was the wife, Hiroko Yajima, who is still the wife of the violist, the then violist of the Juilliard Quartet, Samuel Rhodes. So we were assigned that piece to play, and we started working on it. And then Felix Gallimere, who was one of the great elders of the Marlborough Festival, came and he said, very exciting, but I have to tell you what this piece is about. And he proceeded to say that Smetana had written it in memory of his 4.5-year-old daughter. We looked at one another, the violinist and I, and said, we both have 4.5-year-old daughters. My daughter Erica and her daughter, I think Amy was her name. And they were playmates that were running around all over Marlborough, and all we could think as we were working on this piece was a 4.5-year-old daughter who died. They didn't. We were okay. But it made it very, very easy for us to relate to the tragedy of this piece. So going on a little bit, this was a very early important piece of him. Over a period of time, he became interested in the fate of his country. In 1848, all over Europe, there were revolutions. What was happening was that Europe was divided up into great empires. So this was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but there was a German Empire, and there was a French Empire, there was a Dutch Empire, there was an English Empire, there was a Spanish Empire, there was a Portuguese Empire. It was the time when all of those people sent armies or whatever and took possession of other places. So the people who were more liberal about it looked at their own situation and where they were living. They didn't want to be associated with these big empires because the empires had their own universal rule about how you did things, and they all had individual languages, individual cultures, individual music. And so Smetana began to be more and more interested, and actually he had friends who were involved in the revolt, and it wasn't going very well for them, and he actually went to Sweden where he was teaching for a number of years, and then when things calmed down he came back to Prague, where as he began to get more and more involved with the music of his country, he determined that he had to learn to speak Czech. And so already as somebody, I guess in his 40s or so, he decided he was going to very seriously study it. And he did, in fact, learn to speak the Czech language. He was very involved there in opera production, writing music for choruses, doing all kinds. He wrote a lot of music. He wrote many operas that we don't know about anymore, and of course they were all in the Czech language. But he wrote one that became very famous called The Bartered Bride. And The Bartered Bride, actually, toward the end of his life, it was so popular, he was made guest of honor at its 100th performance in Prague. That was a really big thing. And very close to the end of his life, he wrote a lot of tone poems, music having to do with his country. And I should say that he was also very much supported by the interest of Franz Liszt, and he had met Berlioz. He knew about what was going on in Western European musical cycles. But he wrote this series of 6 tone poems which have the collective title of My Fatherland. And one of them we know very well today. It's the other piece of his that's extremely popular. It's called the Moldau. The Moldau was the big river that went right through his country. And that is more or less what I need to tell you about him, except to say I think he was 60 years old. He had a mental collapse and he died very, very soon thereafter. The piece we're going to hear is in 4 movements, and it alternates in the first 3 movements between the drama of what is coming and happy memories of the little child and all of that, until finally the last movement comes, which is a depiction of this terrible disease that took her away. It's kind of galloping music It's very, very forceful, and it ends very, very dramatically. And I know you're going to be thrilled by it. So here it is. The final piece on our program comes from the great Austrian composer Anton Bruckner. If you know Bruckner at all, you'll say, well, why are you presenting him on a series of chamber music? And that's a right question to ask, because Bruckner is known to us primarily these days for the massive symphonies that he wrote, each generally about an hour long, very complex pieces. But let's go back to his beginnings. Bruckner was born in a small city in Austria near Linz, I would say about halfway between Vienna and Salzburg, if you know your geography. His father was a school teacher, and it was a humble family. And just to give you a position in terms of music history where he is in terms of years, as I mentioned before, he was born in 1824. It was 3 years before Beethoven died, 4 years before Schubert died. Robert Schumann was 15 years old. Brahms was born slightly later. He somehow or other began to play organ at a very early age. And I think his father, who loved music, helped him. Gave him actually lessons on how to play the organ. It seems like he took to that, and he was soon connected to a Catholic abbey, I guess you would call it, called Saint Florian, not too far from where he grew up. And there was somebody who could teach him organ there, and he became really very, very good organ player. So he was a keyboard player, like many composers were. And he was a very serious student. So every place that he went to study, he excelled in his studies. And he deepened in his studies, and he began to write music, and it got more and more knowledgeable about the complexity of music being written around him. He was very, very interested in the music of Richard Wagner and of Franz Liszt. And that really has a huge influence on the way he wrote music in terms of his use of modulations going from one key to another, use of harmonies. It was quite advanced for that time. So he began writing and somehow or other got into the idea of writing symphonies. He completed 8, and he wrote a 9th symphony, which was finished shortly after he died. And those were with such complexity as it went along that you could easily think about Anton Bruckner as a link between Mahler, Gustav Mahler, who, by the way, was a student for a brief time of Bruckner, and Arnold Schoenberg, another great pathfinder in music. So if you listen to the very early Schoenberg music, whether it's the Verklärte Nacht or the Gürrelieder or something like that, you can hear a real link to these very expansive, huge pieces, nothing less than 45 minutes and some more than an hour, in which lots of things happened, and they were more and more complicated. Well, you're going to ask yourself, what does that have to do with our concert tonight? Well, as I said, he was a very good student, and in the middle of all of that, he found a role for himself as a teacher. He moved to Vienna, where he taught both at the Conservatory and at the university, where he was teaching theory. And I should say that the general reaction to Bruckner as a person was that he was a genius and a simpleton. He was very simple in life. He never married. I think he was too shy to approach young women. And we know that later on he was always dreaming about that, but in fact that was not who he was, and certainly what he was religious. He wrote all kinds of music for the church, and he was getting very famous for it, and it was kind of strange because, here he was, this country boy, and people were really recognizing him for the great composer he'd become. I should say also that music at that time in that circle was split between the people who were followers of Wagner and Liszt and people who were followers of Brahms, younger than him but becoming very successful. Brahms was following in the path of his inherited masters, whether Schumann, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, Bach. And Bruckner was more interested in the new things, and there was a great divide. I mean, you had to take sides. You were one side or another. In any case, I don't think he publicly took sides about it, but one associates him more with the Wagner influence than with, let's say, the path that Brahms followed. So the director of the Conservatory in Vienna, named Joseph Helmsberger Jr., was a violinist, and he approached Bruckner and said, "I'd like you to write a string quartet. I have a string quartet." For some reason or other, as Bruckner began, he was thrilled at the invitation to do it. He decided he wanted a second viola, so it is a Bruckner Quintet. And when he finished writing it, which was 1878, 79, around in that period of time, so he was in his 50s. When Helmsberger looked at it, he said, "Oh, well, the scherzo is much too difficult for us, so we're not going to play it. Would you give us another movement?" He did write a movement. And by a couple of years later, the technique and the attitude of the players caught up, and they began to use the scherzo also. So, this is, by the way, a 45-minute piece, so sit comfortably. And I'll tell you just a little bit about what you can listen for. So the first movement is in that usual form, and the four movements are, there's a scherzo and a slow movement and a finale. And when he came to the slow movement, remember the piece is in F major, and he writes it in G flat major, which is a little bit like the chair I'm sitting on suddenly starts floating in the air 6 inches off the floor. We don't know how it got up there, but there's a kind of an elevated mood about it. And I would say that this is the movement of the piece that everybody understands, that is really very deep and sad and pious and full of heart. And I know you're going to feel that way when you hear it. And then it comes with a very complex last movement that ends a little bit orchestrally with some of the strings playing tremolo, which is moving your bow, which is a little bit sounding like one of from his symphonies. So that is his real contribution to our life, and I early on decided on First Monday, where we celebrate great composer's birthday, there was no way but to include him in our series. It's the last piece of our program, and I think you're really going to really get something out of listening to it. So let's go ahead and do that.